everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining today. I am really pleased to be here and to offer really a few thoughts and a few ideas and a few observations about Emily Dickinson. We're celebrating the Poetry Month, and also next month is Emily's 135th anniversary of her death in 1886. She is certainly one of the most loved and most famous American poets, singularly American, if you will. She was born in 1830 in Amherst, Massachusetts, and she died in 1886, also in Amherst, Massachusetts. She was very much homebound. She spent her entire life in family home, in a close-knit community with her friends and family, maintaining epistolary relationships with many people, over 100 correspondents throughout her lifetime, and she was Good evening. I'm sorry, I think I was muted for a while. Yeah, so let me begin again. Welcome to the Emily Dickinson evening. I am very pleased to be here and to offer a few observations and a few vignettes into her life so that we can have a better understanding and appreciation, kind of an encounter with her life, if you will, an encounter with her work as well. Emily Dickinson was born in 1830 in Amherst, Massachusetts, into a well-known family locally, at least. Her grandfather founded Amherst College. Her father was a lawyer and even served in Congress for a term. Her mom was well educated. They were kind of an intellectual family, if you will, and also her siblings were enjoyed kind of intellectual lifestyle, if you will, especially the women, and especially considering the times. She's a 19th century poet, and very often she's described as a romantic. But I like to look at Emily Dickinson and think of her in many different ways. She cannot really be bound to just one category. It's almost impossible to do that. So as much as she's a romantic poet, she's also kind of a proto-modernist. So in much of her writing and much of her work already anticipated modernist movement. And in many ways, she's also experimental. She's very avant-garde, and she even transcends modernity. She's kind of a postmodernist, if you will. So as a romantic, she was interested in nature. She, together with, Emerson and Whitman, she kind of constitutes the big three of American poetry of the 19th century. And she's very much, she was very much formed in the New England mentality, New England kind of intellectual milieu. She was well-read. Like I said, she corresponded with many people. And even though she lived at home, and very often it is said that she was kind of a recluse, and she really didn't engage with many people face to face, she engaged with a lot of people via writing. And there are many different ideas as to why that was the case, whether it was because she simply liked to write, or were there other reasons. And I generally like to think that Emily was somebody who was very focused on her writing, very much engaged with her, with her inner subjectivity. She was somebody who was very focused on the interior, and somebody who was also interested in kind of developing, was engaged with the world around her and with writing. And she preferred that pretty much to the engagement with social circles in which it would be pretty much small talk and exchange of niceties in a parlor. She kind of avoided social life in this way, kind of superficial social life. Making social visits at the time was an order of the day, especially to homes that were kind of prominent in the area. And Emily's household received many calls from people throughout the day. And so she was known to just say, okay, household chores and social visits is something that I simply cannot do. It's just, it's too much. It's something that I really don't want to spend my time. My time is important. I would like to engage with my writing, and I would like to engage with speaking to people more in an intimate tone, more directly, in a way that engages them in a more authentic way. In any case, she was very, like I said, she was very prolific. She started writing early, in her late teens, and her most prolific period falls between 1850s and 1860s. This is that there's a kind of a decade between about 1855 to 1865 where she makes a huge jump in terms of maturing in her writing and developing her themes, and also developing her style. So if you've read her poetry, you will notice that she starts with kind of simpler poems. She's known for the economy of expression, if you will. But she also starts to work with themes like nature, life and living, affection towards others, family relationships, passions, also love, and of course, time, death, and eternity. Those are kind of the themes that Emily Dickinson works throughout her entire life. But as she starts with kind of witty observations and poems that are more, I would say, more sentimental. Her entire work is very lyrical, but the beginning of her work is more, I would say, slightly simpler and more in the character of aphorisms. As she develops in her writing, she becomes much more cryptic, a little bit more difficult to understand, definitely more abstract, and you can almost see how she develops as a writer, that she becomes much more engaged with what she's doing in not only in a very personal way, but also in a very intellectual way. And some of her poetry becomes almost hermetic. And there's a great divide among the scholars, how hermetic Emily Dickinson really is, and whether we have some access to the poetry, or whether she's so personal, she's so kind of closed off, so private in a certain sense, creating almost a private language, if you will. That we are, in a certain sense, is she really a poet in that sense, or is she poet for herself? Is she a poet for herself? So that's one of the big questions that we can keep in mind as we think about Emily Dickinson, whether she's a poet for herself or whether she's a poet for others. And it really, the idea is not to answer the question right away, but to kind of consider that knowing about Emily and reading her poetry, what did she want to accomplish? What did she want to do? How is she presenting herself? And what she thinks constitutes a poetic vocation. So like I said, she kind of started writing early. She was well educated. She attended Amherst Academy for girls. And later she spent a year at the Holyoke Seminary for Women, where she was only for about a year, but that was enough to kind of really give her a very good foundation and prepare her for a lifetime of reading and her own research and her own kind of on her own work. She was able to carry out kind of rigorous, really, writing practice and reading practice throughout her entire life, despite many different health problems, I might add as well. Right. So I would like to start with a letter in order to kind of engage with Emily on her own terms a little bit more. I would like to start with one of her letters, actually, to an editor. And the reason I'm starting with a letter rather than a poem is because it is virtually impossible to gauge the spectrum and the kind of to gauge the meaning of Emily's poetry without some knowledge or a glimpse of her spirit, a glimpse of her personality from her letters. So epistolary practice, writing letters, was not only something she did to keep in touch with people. It's usually agreed that she basically practiced her writing in this way, that she took on many different personas in this way, that she was able to experiment with different so-called literary voices in this way, and that it is kind of in looking at the letters that we can really have a sort of a skeleton key to her poetry, that they really are very complementary. And that without kind of engaging with the letters, it's very difficult sometimes to understand her poetry, especially the later poems, I should say, especially the later poems. So why don't we start with I'm going to share my screen, and I would like to start with the letter that she wrote to an editor who also became her friend later on in life. Just a second, I'll share my screen here. Very good. All right. So I hope you can see this text because I would like you, as I read, I would like you to be, Shimon, can you see the text? If I could have, since I have you on camera. Okay, I'll ask you. Thank you very much. Yes, Margot, hi. All right, very good. So she writes a letter in 1862 to an editor of a paper. She's kind of looking to have her poetry published, but her attitude towards having her poetry in public and printed is ambivalent. All right, she is not really keen on being a public persona. She's an extremely private person, and so as much as she wants to share, as much as she wants to go out there, as much as she keeps in touch with many people and has many blooming friendships, very close friendships, she's also kind of ambivalent about how to present her poetry, how not to betray herself, if you will, how to maintain her authenticity and not to, I don't want to say sell out, but not to become a public figure. I think that was to her more of a, that would have been more traumatic than anything else. So, and also, but she wants to know, how basically how her poetry can be read and how other people see her. She spends so much time writing and so much time collecting her poems that she basically breaks down and writes to this man, Mr. Higginson, Thomas Higginson, who's kind of a man of letters, like I said, and an editor. And she writes this very short letter. She doesn't know him yet, and she writes this very short letter that I think is a great introduction to kind of the spirit of Emily Dickinson and what kind of woman we can expect. So I'm going to read this for you now. So this is what she says. Mr. Higginson, are you too deeply occupied to say if my verse is alive? The mind is so near itself, it cannot see distinctly, and I have none to ask. Should you think it breathed, and had you the leisure to tell me, I should feel quick gratitude. If I make the mistake that you dared to tell me would give me sincere honor toward you, I enclose my name asking you, if you please, sir, to tell me what is true. That will not betray me, it is needless to ask, since honor is its own pawn. So we see here somebody who's, very witty, very bright, and very bold. And at this time, she's asking for the truth. She says, is my verse alive? That is her primary concern. And I think as we read Emily Dickinson's poetry, as we try to actually engage with any literary work, but especially with Emily, since we're talking about her today, the primary question, and this is something that poet discloses to us, right? That the writer discloses to us, is the verse alive? And how is it reaching us? And what makes verse alive? Really. So I think that's pretty important as we try to explicate her poetry and to kind of enter more deeply into her mindset. Let me stop share for a second. Okay, here we go. We're back. Okay, so like I said, she was very productive. She, throughout her life, Emily Dickinson wrote about 1,800 poems that were written in, obviously handwritten, and they were on not only on paper that she saved on letter paper, but also on scraps of paper, on envelopes, on found paper. So it's kind of a very postmodern practice, if you will. If you think about somebody who goes around with little notes in their pockets, this is Emily Dickinson. Basically, that was her practice throughout her life. She wrote about 1,200 letters, and these are the ones that are extant. There are many more that have not survived, but as you can see, that is a fairly broad productivity, really, if you will. She was rather prolific. She also, I think that part of her originality as a writer comes from the fact that she was sort of isolated, and that allowed her to experiment. Like I mentioned before, she experimented not only with the poetry, but she also experimented with letter writing as well. So maybe we could say a few things about the themes that are present in her work, and then we can, as we discuss the themes, we'll look at the poetry and see some samples of how that corresponds more or less with the themes that she engaged. So like I said before, she wrote a lot about nature. And this is kind of natural. She was, as a young girl, she studied botany. She took it fairly seriously. That was an acceptable way for a young woman to engage with science in the 19th century. But it wouldn't be Emily Dickinson if she also didn't read Charles Darwin. All right, so she was a kind of person who did what was expected and then some, right? And always something else, always something that she made uniquely her own. So she's famous for putting together a herbarium. She pressed flowers in her teenage years, and this is really, you could look at this as like kind of the first manuscript of Emily's. There are no verses there. There are only pressed plants in the herbarium, but the layout and the visual is so stunning and so carefully organized that you can kind of have glimpses already of somebody's mind working with paper, working with page, working with layout, working with typography. She hand wrote all the names of the plants. And it was very obvious that it was a very aesthetic work that she not merely collected, but she actually arranged and organized and kind of created a really beautiful handmade book, a leather-bound portfolio. This portfolio is now available. It's in its digital version from a Harvard library. If you want to go online and look at their digital collections, they do have the original, but the original is not available. It's very fragile, so it's in safekeeping, absolutely unavailable. But like I said, it's digitized, and you can see how beautifully all the pages are laid out by her. And so she was an observer, you know, she observed, she studied plants, she also drew plants, she observed the cycle of seasons, and she drew her inspiration from that. So I would like to perhaps go back to another poem of hers, and also mention, as I'm doing share screen again, that there are several poems I prepared for today, and I want to start with this one. A bird came down to walk. So it's out 359. Emily Dickinson very rarely titled her poems. All right, so most of them are without titles. Another avant-garde practice of hers. They're without titles, and the numbers indicate simply their position within her collection. So the 359 is fairly early, probably maybe late 1850s, maybe 1858, something like that. And it's one of the earlier ones. Anything that approaches higher numbers like 1263 would be something obviously that is from later period in her life. And like I kind of already mentioned, the later poems are a little bit more cryptic and a little bit more difficult to understand. In any case, my own personal approach to reading poetry is that it's very important to let the poetry penetrate you rather than you try to necessarily explain the poem away and kind of try to, especially if you're asking somebody, tell me what it means, that kind of destroys the purpose of the poem. The poem is meant to linger. The poem is meant to linger and kind of reverberate, if you will, in our mind and in our heart, and to awaken something, right? And this is really the way Emily also wanted her poems to be read. She never really explained what she meant. In some of her letters, she discloses some things about her poetic practice and her vocation as a poet, but those lines are not meant to explain the actual poetry. So she was very much aware that she was writing a little bit in a riddle form, that some of her writing was cryptic. She was aware of that, but she was in this way, I think, inviting the reader not to provide their own any, but to kind of engage with the word and try to fill out, if you will, fill in any kind of missing blanks or any blanks or any loopholes that they find on their own. So here we have, and I'm also not going to explain her poetry, like I mentioned before. So I'm going to read it, and maybe we can, I can say a few words, but really what I want is, I want us to kind of have an experience of the poem and really have an experience of Emily, if you will. So here is I don't want to say a typical, but one of the many poems that she wrote about birds. A bird came down the walk. He did not know I saw. He bit an angleworm in halves and ate the fella raw. And then he drank dew from a convenient grass, and then hopped sideways to the wall to let a beetle pass. He glanced with rapid eyes, that hurried all abroad. They looked like frightened beads, I thought. He stirred his velvet head. Like one in danger, cautious, I offered him a crumb, and he unrolled his feathers and rowed him softer home. Then oars divide the ocean to silver for a seam, or butterflies of banks of noon leap plashless as they swim. Economy of expression is one of the characteristics of Emily Dickinson, and also very strong meter. Um, One of the things about reading her poetry, do not try not to get stuck on the meter. This is one of the means she's using. She's kind of exploiting, if you will, but very often her meanings are quite ambiguous. And especially the ending here, I think, is quite ambiguous. So we have this jump from something that is very structured, very easy to follow, almost like a rhyme that you would find in a nursery in a certain sense, right? And then you have this development, this opening towards the end of the poem. This is a very typical practice of hers, right? To provide a simple background, a simple observation, and then suddenly explode the poem into another realm and kind of confuse the reader, if you will, or puzzle the reader. So that's one of the bird poems. Another one related to it that I would like to read today is one of the very famous Emily Dickinson poems, Hope is the Thing with Feathers. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. You will notice Emily Dickinson liked to capitalize certain words. We really have no record of why she chose certain words to do that. We can only guess kind of from within the context of the poem why she would do that. This is a practice, this is an I believe English-based practice, and she read a lot of English poems, especially romantic poems from England. So she picked some of it, but she uses it in her own way. So she capitalizes certain words, which is one of the characteristics of her writings. And of course, the famous Dickinson dashes, right? I think she dashes quite a bit, and it's really kind of delightful, if you ask me. Those are ways to divide the verses and to kind of break them up, but they're also they're also a kind of an experiment, really, because nobody used dashes in this way prior to Emily Dickinson, and I believe she still remains the queen of dashes. All right, so here you go. I hope you can see the poem here. Okay. Yeah, so singular punctuation, there also the punctuation is a little bit different, right? You can see that there are no periods or commas. So her use of punctuation is also kind of unique. Very good. Okay, let's go back. Okay, another thing that we should, I want to speak, since we are speaking about the themes, and this was the theme of nature, all right? So we just barely touched on the theme of nature, but there are plenty of other themes with which she works. So cycle of seasons is another one. She kind of connects us to the cycle of life. She loved spring, she loved all the seasons, all right? Emily Dickinson loved nature in general, she loved all the seasons, but she connects, a lot of her poems are about spring. She uses the cycle of season to kind of develop her understanding of time as well. It's kind of understandable, you know. She lived, like I said, she lived in a countryside. She was very deeply connected with nature, and this is kind of what, by common sense, this is what you would expect. You observe how nature works, and you kind of incorporate it into your own thinking, into your own mindset, into how reality is set up, really, by the work of the cycle of seasons. Like I said before, she also is interested in plants, local trees, local flowers. She does have some exoticism in some of her poetry, especially where she takes flights of fancy and wants to go to exotic lands. She's always wanted to travel. She didn't travel so much. She did go to Washington and Philadelphia at a certain time, but she never traveled overseas or never to exotic countries that she read about. But she was definitely interested in traveling overseas and in seeing, kind of exotic islands and foreign countries. This was one of the ways in which she liked to escape, to think about these possible trips, right? To think about these possible visits that would kind of awaken her to new worlds. And basically what she did is she incorporated some of that wonder and some of that excitement that she felt for exploring new spaces into her local poetry, right? Into the way she saw herself. She didn't see herself as enclosed. She saw herself as, located somewhere, but then really reaching out towards the entire world. Expansion is one of the main themes of her poetry, like I mentioned before, maybe. She was really somebody who wanted to always reach out further and further away, further and further outside of herself in this way. So another one is the sky, which is something that many poets utilize in their poetry. And this is another way of reaching outwards, right? The sea, the sky, cycle of seasons. So really the universe and stars and planets, all of this kind of constitutes the naturalistic themes of Emily's poetry. However, I want to say that unlike romantics who kind of glorify nature as something that we could be standing in awe of, Emily Dickinson is slightly more naturalistic and uses a much more observational tone in writing and uses witticism and kind of observation to bring the point home, so to speak. She is also interested in being alive, which I know is kind of you would expect that people would be interested in being alive, but Emily Dickinson is somebody who singularly writes about what it feels like for her to be alive, what it means to be a human being, what it means to wake up in the morning and kind of open your eyes and see the world. She spends quite a bit of time on that. She engages humor a lot as well, together with her observations. She's very witty, and interspersed with those observations on herself, on nature, on her personal life are also a lot of observations about writing and poetic vocation. Those are kind of more clandestine, if you will. She writes, she also uses letters to write about a poetic vocation, but you can also find that in her poems, kind of what it means for her to be a poet. What does it mean? What it requires and what it calls for, really. She's also really interested in memory and introspection and retrospection. She also explores affections, especially love and friendships, and passions, such as attachments and loss. So she's interested, as she kind of observes the cycle of seasons. She's also looking at this idea of loss and rebirth as well. So those are kind of bigger themes in her work that you can find that are kind of very interesting. And finally, time, death, and eternity are things that figure very strongly in her work. She grouped her own poems. She started grouping her poems in around, I believe, late 1950s. And she was grouping them around those themes, around the themes of nature, around the themes of kind of like family and relationships, and then time, death, and eternity. Emily's view of more abstract terms such as time and eternity are kind of characterized by, I would say, like a romantic spirit in which she longs for death and this kind of resolution of herself, of all her passions, of all her longing, into kind of you would say like an anonymous, but also anonymous but love permeated unity with the universe. So she is not somebody who is interested in specific deity. Her relationship with religion is famously ambiguous. She was, I would say that she was basically very independent. And she was somebody who really thought for herself, but also engaged herself so much. She had so many questions. towards life and towards other people, that she questioned everything. It was very difficult for her to follow prescribed rules or to attend local church. There's a famous letter called the Rebellion Letter, in which she says, everybody's going to this church and everybody's praising the local pastor, and I would like to be able to do that. I would like to convert. I would like to have this kind of big experience of belonging to Christ, to be a Christian, but I really can't do that because I'm asking myself the question, is this really the way for me? Is this really something that is going to that is something that I'm being asked for by God, or is this something that the community is asking me? So she was asking all these questions, and she said, I stand alone, I cannot do it. I have to encounter God on my own. And this is really so in that sense, she's kind of similar to Emerson. Her spirit, I say in this sense, is slightly Emersonian, although of course she is uniquely her own. I want to stress that she's uniquely her own. And as much as she was engaging with kind of what is the place of religion in individual's life, she was also hotly kind of engaging with this idea of what is the role of a woman, and what is to be expected of her, what she can expect as a woman out of her own life, but what is also expected of her. So her poetic vocation, or her vocation to write, was not something that was necessarily very much encouraged. Of course, at that time, the usual way was to receive a decent education. Like I said, she was from a prominent family, was to receive education and to get married. And she, just like towards religion, she had ambivalent feelings. She also did not really, it's not that she didn't see a purpose of marriage. She pretty much questioned its value for a woman's life. Maybe we could put it this way. And she kind of saw woman as being at the dawn of her life, looking forward to this idea of being engaged and being loved, that this was something that was very elevating and very enriching, but that married life required certain sacrifices or certain commitments that not every woman can offer. And she was thinking, of course, about herself. So when she was thinking about, taking care of the house, running a household, and then engaging with the husband, providing for the family, raising children, she basically kind of stepped back and said, I don't think that's for me. I don't know if I can engage with that in a way that is expected of me. And even I don't even know if this is something that I want to do. And in fact, I think I might be disappointed if I do go that route. So there are some poems, they're called the wife poems. She wrote those once her friends started to get married, and once her brother Austin got married with one of her best friends, and Susan. And some of her other female friends were finding suitors, and they were getting married. She was distancing herself more and more from the idea of marriage, and it was I don't think it was for selfish reasons. I think she really could not find her way in ordinary tasks, if you will. She famously, I don't want to say resented, but evaded, if you will, household chores as much as possible. She did like baking and she did like gardening. She did those things, but those were very closely connected with her writing. When it came to just running a household, she thought it was a bit of a waste of time. She really put writing as kind of her primary focus and primary way in life. And she also realized it was a little bit controversial. So I wanted to mention that she was kind of a proto-feminist, if you will, and many women readers read her in this way, that she was kind of a proto-feminist. Okay, I wanted to read a couple more poems so that we will not be distracted by all the information, and we have a chance to kind of engage with the poems themselves as well. Here, let me go back to my text here, and maybe now, why don't we read one of her passion poems, number 269 from her portfolio. Wild nights, where I would be, wild nights should be our luxury. Futile the winds to a heart in port, done with the compass, done with the chart. rowing in Eden. Ah, the sea, might I but more tonight in thee. Right? So the sentiment of this poem is very easy to explicate. It's not too complicated, but it's very beautiful and very sweet. It comes, like I said, comes early in her work before her writing becomes cryptic. A lot of the poems that we are reading tonight, actually all of them, were sent to her friends in letters. So this is the way in which she was sharing her work, not through printed word in magazines or in books, but she preferred to send poems to her friends and kind of ask their opinion. Sometimes the poems are cryptic to the reader because they respond directly to the person that she's writing to. So whatever was their discussion that they carried on before, or whatever was the conversation that they already carrying, Emily would sometimes, instead of responding in prose, in a letter, she would respond with a short poem. So this one is one of those. Wild Nights, Wild Nights. It's a very famous one. It's one of the best known. And I guess one of the ones that we can repose in kind of with ease. And very easily identify with what she's trying to say here, the kind of sentiment that she's trying to connect us with. Okay, let's look at there are a couple that I really wanted to look at, which is I Am Nobody. I'm Nobody, that's a very well-known one. And another one is Tell It Truth, but Tell It Slant, which is another way of kind of getting a glimpse of Emily's intelligence and kind of brilliance, if you will. So why don't we read the Tell the Truth, but Tell It Slant first? And comes later in her portfolios, as you can see, number 1263. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies, too bright for our infirm delight, the truth superb surprise. As lighting to the children east with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. I wanted to mention that the idea of circuit is something that she picks up a little bit from Emerson, but then she develops in her own way. It's the idea of circumference and expansion. Whenever she uses this word, like I said before, maybe at the very beginning of this presentation, Emily developed a sort of a private language or her own lexicon of words, and they're interrelated. So once you get a sense of the matrix that she's using, you have a better sense of, because there's a great continuity between throughout her entire corpus. So once you get a sense of what she's trying to say, then it's easier to understand even the more cryptic works. But in this case, the circuit is capitalized, and it means basically expansion, circumference, reaching outwards, And then the truth is also capitalized. For Emily Dickinson, truth and beauty were one thing. She was very aesthetic in this way. So we can also read it, the truth must dazzle gradually. And the reason it dazzles is because it's also beautiful. So it's luminous. Luminosity in her poetry is connected both with the kind of intellectual knowledge, but also with aesthetics, with beauty. And with moral as well, with moral beauty as well. She's a lot of her writing is connected with this, with high moral standards for herself. I mean, sincerity being one of them, but then kind of a commitment to truth, commitment to goodness, commitment to really to her environment, to her friends. All of that is present in her work. So let's go back to the one that I paired with this one, which is, of course, I'm Nobody. And in this poem, I like to think about this poem in connection with her attitude towards printed word and towards having her work printed officially or being recognized as a poet. All right. This is what she says. I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Don't tell, they would advertise, how dreary to be somebody, how public, like a frog, to tell one's name, they lifelong June, to an admiring bog. So Emily is very much aware of the fact that it's better to be nobody, that is yourself, than somebody who's an empty, shallow shell, empty, shallow kind of shell, right? I wish I could engage some of you, and I wish I could hear your thoughts, because whenever we have poetry meetings with our group, we always share thoughts and our impressions, and it's so good to hear from different people what they think. I think it opens up a conversation so much better than anything I can deliver as a talk. But I don't know if I can do that actually. If anybody would like to make a comment at this point, I think we're about halfway through the program. I'm very open to hearing some of your thoughts or some of your questions. I think we would do Emily an injustice if I just kept talking. There are at least a few more poems that I would like to read, but really, if you would like to say anything, unmute yourself and either comment or ask a question. I will try to respond to the best of my ability. And to the best of my knowledge. But if you just want to comment, or if you have a favorite Emily Dickinson poem that you would like to read, I think we can venture and do that today. Anyone? Okay, I see questions here in the chat. All right. Okay, because I could not stop for death. I think I have this poem. Let me see. I could not stop for that. Just a second. Where's my Emily Dickinson book? I want to say, from what I remember, it's in the middle of her works. Quite honestly, it's not towards the end of her life. It's in the middle of her work. Because I could not stop for that. He kindly stopped for me. Yes, I don't think I chose this poem as one of the ones we'll read today. Let me double check. Okay, no, I don't see it. Yeah, that's not the ones. I tried to select some that are not as famous so that we could have a better glimpse, not only of the famous one, not only the top 10, but also some of the other ones. Okay. Oh, thank you, Shimon, for your kind comment. Love permeated unity with the universe. Thank you very much. Thank you. Is there a biography of Dickinson that I would recommend? There is one, and I'll be happy to, Carolyn, I'll be happy to write to you after the meeting. I cannot remember the name. It's from the 1950s, and I believe the name of the man is Johnson. But it's still the best biography written of Emily Dickinson.
Thank you. Great.
Yes, and I'll be happy to look it up because I do have that information.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. David says that Emily was a reader of John Ruskin. Yes, she was. I put together her reading list so that we could enjoy knowing whom she read, because her reading list was pretty excellent. I love reading lists. If you know me, you know that I enjoy looking at those. Kind of get a better sense of what is the provenance of people's ideas and sentiments and where they come from with their work, but with their poetic works or their literary works. But here, Emily was a reader of John Ruskin. What you said about her aesthetic intellectual views made me think that there are shared perspectives. Yes, I agree. Yeah, she definitely was influenced by him. Yeah, she also, I find interesting and always piques my curiosity to know how she decided to capitalize, because it also seems quite unique and intentional. It's completely intentional, 100% thought through and intentional. It is evident from her writings. Actually, recent scholarship of Emily Dickinson, especially in the last 20, 30 years, specifically studies the original manuscripts to see how she laid out things on how she laid out words on paper, and how she punctuated, and whether she used pen on pencil. And it's definitely agreed that she was very intentional in her capitalization of words. I think reading, once you look at different poems and you see the context of the words, you can guess why she thought some words were more important and kind of deserved a greater emphasis, basically. But with the dashes, I think it's a lot more adventurous, I would say, because the dashes are completely new. It's not a practice that was in practice at the time. So capitalizing different words was something that people have done. Famously Blake, William Blake, poet from England, right? Um, and then Shimon says, in German, aren't all nouns capitalized? I actually do not know. All right, I actually do not know, but I think that might be the case. I know a lot of words are. Her own inspiration for capitalizations came from English poets for sure. That's definitely, I mean, I think she even admitted to that. So looking at Emily's reading list, if anybody's interested, she read romantic poets from England. She wrote on both sides of the Atlantic, I would like to add. So she read people from Europe and she read people from the United States. She was very well read with contemporary literature in the US. Famously, supposedly she did not read Walt Whitman because he was considered indecent. And her dad was against it. So she publicly said she hasn't, but word on the street is that she has. So I'm just going to leave it at that, okay? But the other people that she has read are the Bronte sisters, the Brownings, George Eliot, Thomas Carlyle, Charles Darwin, like I mentioned before, Matthew Arnold, who was a famous critic, Ruskin is another person. And she was also very much interested in the Bible and in Shakespeare. And she kept those two close by and used them as kind of a inspiration, really, and especially the Bible. So even though she wasn't religious in a conventional sense for the time, she was religious, if you will, in her own way, and she definitely was interested in divinity, in God. She was interested in God. Let's put it this way: she was not an atheist. She was not even an agnostic. I think she was just an extremely private person, and so that religion remained entirely within a private sphere and a private experience, but also was very much touched upon in many of her poems. All right, and you get a sense of that once you start reading. So let me see. I think these are all the questions. Yes, Rick said that this book is very expensive on Amazon. Look at the libraries, I guess. Okay. Hello, Susan. I'm actually not a teacher. I'm just somebody who loves poetry and loves literature. That's all. And I love to share with the community of other thinkers and readers and writers. And that's how Tanya found me, basically. Looking at some of the events we had on the poetry meetup, she connected with me and she asked if I would be interested in giving this talk, and I agreed. It's a little bit of a different format. Normally, like I said, we have more of a, we engage much more with the text together as a group, as a community, and we kind of discuss the poems as a group, and that's a great experience. But this is also not bad. And then Shimon says that his feeling is that the dashes help us determine the pacing that she wants. I agree. And they guide us, they could guide how pauses are part of the rhythm she heard. Yes, yes, that's a great observation. Thank you, Shimon. Yes, so maybe we could, let's go to another poem while we still have some time. Okay, here we go. This is one of the last poems I wanted to read. This one too. This is one of her famous aphorisms, or I call it famous. I mean, I don't know how famous it is, but it is in her manuscripts. But this is the definitive form that she was using, so extremely short and to the point. Fame is a bee. It has a song, it has a sting. Too, it has a wing. So there you go. Why don't we read this poem? Number 336 in her manuscripts. Yeah, why don't we read this one first? Let me see if I have. Oh yes. I would like to maybe this one first, the one on the funeral. She was deeply engaged with the idea of passing, dying, and loss, as she observed within her family, but also as she was anticipating her own. And like I said before, it was not, she wasn't looking at death with any kind of fear or anxiety. She was very much, in a certain sense, looking forward to it like a true romantic. So here we go, number 340. I felt the funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading, treading, till it seemed that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service like a drum kept beating, beating, till I thought my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll, as all the heavens were a ball, and being but an ear, and I and silence some strange race, wrecked, solitary, here. And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down, and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. So a lot of her poems are kind of characteristically left open at the end. Even though you have a very strong rhythmic structure, you arrive at the end and you realize there's more to be said. She doesn't conclude. This happens especially in her later poetry, but this one I think is a very good example of that, where she has a very strong, very concrete opening, and then poem begins to expand and expand, and then we end on this puzzling, if you will, puzzling ending a little bit, right? And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down, and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. Very unusual. If you would like to say anything, I can stop share for a second, but if not, we can just keep going. It's 7:20, so I would like to read at least a couple more poems, and say a few things about how Emily Dickinson circulated. So maybe I should do that first. Let me stop share for a second so I can see you all, and say that. So for Emily, when she died, people knew she was a poet within the kind of larger expanded circle of friends that she had, which was at least 100 people that she corresponded with on a regular basis. I don't know if you can imagine that, but that's a huge number to keep in touch with people and in close relationships. We're not speaking just writing a thank you note. Those are letters that are very personal, and they're always charged with a lot of meaning. And often, like I said, she would include poems with her letters to share with others. And her fame really grew by word of mouth. So people were reading her poems and then sharing with others and saying, Emily wrote again, and this is what she, this is one of her poems. They would gather together with her poems. And she became kind of she became a local poet laureate of New England first, before she became known in the United States. When she passed away, Mabel Todd, who was also a mistress of her brother, she edited. Basically, when let's start again. Then when Emily Dickinson passed away, in her records were found all the poems on loose scraps of paper, and also some hand-sewn books with poems, certain collections, like little portfolios that she has handmade. And so people realized that actually she was extremely prolific, and there were many, many records of her poetic works. And Mabel Todd decided to edit and put everything together. Mr. Higginson, to whom she wrote earlier, was also another editor of her kind of early works. But these works were so heavily edited, they didn't know what to do with the punctuation. They didn't know whether these were mistakes or whether she meant that on purpose. They didn't know how to capitalize the words. They weren't sure whether this was, again, how seriously it had to be taken. And some of the poems who were slightly more daring were kept out of the early collections, just so you know. So at first, she and once her poems became published after her death, again, she's kind of a local poet laureate, not anybody who was known across the United States, mostly in New England and on the East Coast. And then in the 1950s, I believe Harvard University acquired authorial rights and publishing rights to all her works. And another edition, complete edition of all her works was put out, and this time without any omissions. But still, punctuation, hyphenation, capitalization of words, all of that was not studied deeply enough and in detail enough. And so many things from that 1950s editions are kind of are not as accurate as we would like them to be. So they're still not the authoritative edition. Only in the, believe it or not, only in the late 1990s, there was a kind of a commitment to really publishing not only complete works, but also the very faithful publication of her poems. And it's that edition from 1998 that kind of serves as a blueprint really for the work of Emily Dickinson. And this is where the scholars look to now to see, it's the most authentic, if you will, transcription of her work from written in hand to published in book form. All right, and so this only happened really very recently when you think of it. She always was a well-loved poet, and somebody very much appreciated, and yet it's only within really the last 30 years that her poetry is really available to, as it was meant to be seen. So that's what I wanted to say. I also wanted to share something with the letter from the letter that she wrote to another of her men of letter friends, Mr. Holland, who was an editor for another magazine. In this letter, she tells him about her poetic vocation, so it's a very unique one. And she says, my business is circumference, which means expansion. My business is circumference. My business is to love. My business is to sing. And this is not altogether. I put these phrases together to kind of, present to you in a nutshell, if you will, or in a succinct form, what she saw herself as, right? What was her vocation as a poet? What she wanted to be. But the idea is to expand, to love, and to sing. So those were the three things. And when you read her poetry, you really get a sense of that. That's what she was interested in, and you connect with her. It's very easy to connect with her work in that way. All right, let me go back to the poems so that we can enjoy some of Emily's original work before we finish this evening. Here, so I wanted to read this poem before I got my eye put out. I thought that was an interesting sentiment. And another one, Banish Air from Air, which is a very abstract poem, but I think it's super interesting, quite modernist. Not only in its, there's a sobriety about it, sobriety and abstractness that make me think of modernist poetry. That is, she's somebody who kind of anticipates the, somebody like T.S. Eliot in a certain sense. And then this word is not conclusion. This is the last poem for today. So let me read those, and then we'll have some concluding statements. Okay, here we go. Number 336. Before I got my eye put out, I liked as well to see as other creatures that have eyes and know no other way. But were it told to me today that I might have the sky for mine, I tell you that my heart would split for size of me. The meadows, mine, the mountains, mine, all forest, stintless stars, as much of noon as I could take between my finite eyes. The motions of the dipping birds, the morning's ember road for mine. To look at what I liked, the news would strike me dead. So safer guess, with just my soul, open the window pane where other creatures put their eyes, incautious of the sun. I think that's one of my favorite Emily Dickinson poems. It's really beautiful. I don't think I have to explain it. It's so gorgeous. All right. Another one, it's the cryptic Banish Air from Air. She liked to read, to write in riddle form, and this is one of those. Okay, this is definitely a riddle. Banish Air from Air, number 963. Banish air from air, divide light if you dare. They'll meet while cubes in a drop or pellets of shape fit. Films cannot annul, odors return whole, force flame, and with a blunt push over your impotence flits steam. This is extremely experimental. It's very difficult to gauge what she's trying to say in this poem. I'm not embarrassed to say that this is very cryptic to me. But it doesn't mean it cannot be enjoyed. We can always start guessing about what she's trying to accomplish here. The phrasing is really beautiful. Banish air from air, divide light if you dare. Odors return whole, force flame. And with a blunt push over your impotence, flits steam. Yeah, so here's Emily Dickinson and one of her most enigmatic, if you will. And then the last one, number 373. Okay. This world is not conclusion. A species stands beyond, invisible as music, but positive as sound. It beckons and it baffles. Philosophy don't know, and through a riddle at the last, sagacity must go. To guess it puzzles scholars, to gain it, men have borne contempt of generations and crucifixion, shown fate slips and laughs and rallies, blushes if any see, plucks at the twig of evidence and asks avain the way. Much gesture from the pulpit, strong hallelujahs roll, narcotics cannot still the tooth that nibbles at the soul. So, okay. Very good. Thank you very much, everyone. It's 7:29. Thank you for joining today. It was a pleasure to speak about Emily Dickinson. Read her poetry, try to engage with the riddles, and thank you very much again for spending this hour with me while I had a chance to talk a little about her. Definitely one of the best American poets.